Back in the mid-1980s, a 12-issue maxi-series tackled complex issues about superheroes and the role they can and should play in their fictional worlds. It was dark, violent, and a complete departure from most of the mainstream comics of that era. No, we're not talking about Watchmen. This is about another groundbreaking series, Squadron Supreme. Watchmen is deserving of all of the praise it gets, but Squadron Supreme was deconstructing the notion of superheroes a good year before Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' landmark tale.
We actually put this together a little bit before Watchmen. That's something I like to mention.
Squadron Supreme was years ahead of its time. You can see threads of its influence in later epics like Kingdom Come and Civil War, and even in The Boys. And yet, 35 years later, it's a comic book that still doesn't get its due.
It was still a remarkably prescient book for its time of where people were going to go with comics a few years later.
Let's go behind the panel and put some long overdue respect on a true cult classic, 1985's Squadron Supreme. The Squadron has actually been around since the Silver Age. Created by Roy Thomas and Sal Buscema, it was originally a foursome of evil known as the Squadron Sinister, who were created by one of the Elders of the Universe, the Grandmaster, to fight the Avengers. The Squadron members were designed as thinly veiled analogs to DC's Justice League. A couple of years later, the same four characters reappeared, this time as the Squadron Supreme, heroes from the alternate reality of Earth 712. The name change confused fans and Marvel staffers. The cover to Avengers 141 even called them the Squadron Sinister, but the story inside referred to them by their updated name. Their ranks grew over the years as the team made occasional appearances in Thor and in the Defenders, but the Squadron Supreme fell off the map for several years, until a writer and editor at Marvel named Mark Gruenwald had a radical idea. He was a particularly big fan of the Justice League, but since he worked for Marvel, the Squadron was the closest he would get to writing DC's top team. Ralph, you were the editor on the Squadron Supreme maxi-series that Mark Gruenwald wrote. What do you remember about that series?
We're both big fans really of the Justice League because when we were kids, this was pre-Marvel, you were reading the Julie Schwartz Justice League comics and Green Lantern and Flash. And we had counterpart characters in the Marvel Universe for them, the Squadron Supreme. So we thought, if you had characters this powerful, like Hyperion and Dr. Spectrum and all, wouldn't they really try to manage society? What would happen if they did?
It was a what-if comic. What if there were these people with such superpowers that they could essentially take over the world, take over the country? If they had that potential, what would eventually happen to them?
Gruenwald's story was a continuation of sorts to the Squadron's most previous appearance in the Defenders series. A plot from J.M. DeMatteis and Don Perlin had the Defenders going to Earth 712 to help defeat the Overmind, who had taken mental control over the Squadron. He used them to take over that world. The Squadron's 12-issue series began with the team facing the ensuing fallout. The United States was in shambles, and the heroes were feared and hated. Hyperion, the team's Superman-like leader, decides the Squadron has the power to help fix the nation's problems. Spoiler alert, it doesn't go as they planned. The heroes take control of the government and begin a year-long crusade to shape a better world. They create a behavior modification program to erase people's negative tendencies. The Utopia program promises to eliminate crime, poverty, and illness. Nighthawk quits the team he helped create in protest. He cannot fathom saving the world by taking it over. The questions the story raised were simply not possible in the main Marvel books during that point in comics history.
We wouldn't be doing that with the Avengers, but we had this entire other group of characters. What if they really wanted to manage society? And what if one of them, Nighthawk, didn't like that idea? He thought they were going too far.
The moral dilemma puts Nighthawk at odds with his old friend Hyperion. And if this all sounds a bit familiar, well, maybe it's because Marvel's 2006 Civil War crossover was rooted in a similar conflict of ideas between the heroes Captain America and Iron Man. In 1985, though, these types of questions were almost never raised in mainstream superhero comics. It's why Macchio thinks the Squadron miniseries has been underappreciated. Do you think that story gets overlooked and given short shrift when people look back at the great comics of the 80s?
The impact that it had and the important issues that we were talking about it before books like Watchmen came out. And Watchmen is a brilliant work. But I think what Mark did also was brilliant.
Much like Watchmen would do, Squadron contemplated the purpose of a superhero within society. Hyperion and the team thought they knew better, that their great power gave them the right to decide what's best for America. There's a subtle yet pivotal moment in the second issue of Watchmen when Ozymandias declares that none of the world's problems are insurmountable. His arrogance is very much like Hyperion's when he decides a squadron can fix everything. The danger of incredibly flawed people having vast amounts of power was a major component of the Squadron series. In that regard, it echoed themes that would later appear in Kingdom Come, the 1996 classic by Mark Waid and Alex Ross. It's also a key aspect of Garth Ennis and Derek Robertson's The Boys, which has been adapted into a streaming hit on Amazon Prime. Squadron was one of the first comics to point out that having great power without a great moral compass can make you a really bad superhero. Some of the Squadron members, like the immature and unstable Nuke and the astoundingly insecure Golden Archer, exemplified this fact. And despite a sprawling cast that reaches nearly 24 characters at its peak, Squadron Supreme thrives on its characterization. Nearly every hero gets their time in the spotlight. Some of the best moments are reserved for the noble and emotionally vulnerable Power Princess, the conflicted but driven Kyle Richmond, aka Nighthawk, and the most tragic figure in the story, Tom Thumb. The smallest Squadron member's moral quandary drives much of the tale. Always feeling inadequate around his more powerful teammates, Tom puts immense pressure on himself to find a cure for cancer. In his desperation, he travels to the future to steal the cure, violating his own code. 35-year-old spoiler alert. Tom dies in the story. His death is one of the most powerful moments in the entire series, and it happens completely off-screen.
A lot of Marvel's characters, which are wonderful characters, but they're trademarks and they're icons. It's very difficult to develop an icon because development means that you may go somewhere that changes them. These characters were fresh. You didn't have to explain their superpowers, where they got them or anything like that. You just took them as was, and they could grow and they could change and they could get pregnant and they could fall hopelessly in love with the wrong person. And then besides which, just that problem of what do we do?
By 1985, comics had already begun its maturation process. Because of the deaths of Gwen Stacy and Jean Grey, mortality and grief had become major themes within the Marvel Universe. In the Avengers, spousal abuse had been raised with the collapse of the marriage of Hank and Janet Pym. But Squadron Supreme raised the stakes on a societal level. It was asking, at what point does the price of peace become too high a cost?
Are we going to take away everybody's guns? The super speed guy could do that. In fact, did it and just collected them all in a giant pile. Obviously, that's a bit of controversy. Can you do that in America? Well, they could. So where does that leave you?
For an 80s superhero book, Squadron Supreme is surprisingly light on fisticuffs, but it makes up for it with an epic final issue battle between Nighthawk's team, the Redeemers, and the Squadron. Decades later, it remains one of the most brutal slugfests we've ever seen in a mainstream Marvel book. A half dozen characters died in the battle, including one of the main figures, Nighthawk. Macchio admits he was initially against the idea of killing him off.
Mark was very into the series, and the one place where he and I diverged, but I think he was right ultimately, was I didn't really want to see any of the characters killed off. And he said, well, in the last issue, we want to bring some of that in here, that if they're going to battle the way they're going to battle, some of them are going to be casualties. So I felt, he's writing it, let it go.
In that final double-sized issue, Nighthawk tells Hyperion why the Utopia program was doomed to fail from the start. He says, today's Utopia could be tomorrow's totalitarian state. Can future leaders be trusted to do the right thing? His words are emblematic of the relevancy Squadron Supreme maintains to this day.
What's important about it are the issues that we were talking about in there, the societal issues.
I think a lot of those things got their start with things like Squadron Supreme. It was actually interesting to throw those conflicting ideas together, and then they became very important to Marvel to do those kind of things.
To be clear, this is not about arguing that Squadron Supreme is better than Watchmen. Moore's incisive, layered writing and Gibbons' elegant artwork tell a much more nuanced story. Squadron tackles big issues in a big, straightforward way, in an approach that very much resembles the 80s superhero comics era it was a part of. And the art is even a bit inconsistent, as pencils shifted from Bob Hall in the earlier issues to John Buscema, and later Paul Ryan due to deadline concerns. And there are enough word balloons in the series to make Brian Bendis green with envy. But when we're discussing comics that push boundaries and help change the game, Squadron Supreme certainly deserves a place in that conversation. With great power, there must also come great responsibility is a bedrock principle of the Marvel Universe. Squadron Supreme may have been the first Marvel comic to ask, what happens when heroes take that responsibility too far? But Hall disagrees with the premise that the series was ahead of its time.
I think that the other stuff was a little bit behind the time. I think the time was ripe for that story, as was proven then by the Watchmen coming out very, very quickly after that.
As of yet, Squadron Supreme has failed to hit the mainstream or be developed for a broader audience, unlike other comics that tackled similar societal issues just as well. But while the series may get historically slighted, Hall says the Squadron fanbase is a strong and loyal group he often sees at conventions.
One of the things I'm most remembered for is my run, which was about half the series on Squadron Supreme. People are constantly bringing me those books to sign, so I don't really have a handle on whether it got overlooked or not. In my life, it didn't get overlooked.
Despite a stellar career with highlights that included a decade-long run on Captain America, a memorable stint writing Quasar and other books, Squadron Supreme is considered the pinnacle of Grunwald's comic career.
Some years later, I was sitting in a coffee house, and the guy that ran the coffee house used to sit and grinding coffee and reading the New York Times. And when he saw something interesting, he'd bring it over to you and say, hey, look at this article. Well, he brought something over and said, hey, there's a guy at Marvel who just died, who had his ashes, once his ashes put into printer's ink. And I picked it up and said, oh my God, Mark passed away. But he was so fond of the series that he requested that his ashes be put into printer's ink and used in a printing of Squadron Supreme. And so a couple of months later, a little piece of Mark arrived in the mail of a reprint of Squadron Supreme, and his ashes were thrown into the printer's ink.
Wow, that is incredible.
That's how strongly Mark felt about that series.
While that anecdote has become a part of the Squadron story and of Grunwald's personal legend, Macho prefers that his old friend really be remembered for how he used his masterwork to challenge the notion of superhero storytelling and help push comics in a bolder, more mature direction.
The idea of overbearing superheroes, of overbearing powers that may be benevolent, but may just want to, do a little bit too much is something that just has relevance all the time.
Hope you enjoyed this week's Behind the Panel. Be sure to hit that subscribe button to get more awesome comic book videos. Go ahead, do it. And remember, check out my weekly column on SYFYWIRE.com and listen to the Behind the Panel podcast. It's an audio documentary series all about comics and the men and women who create them. Be sure to subscribe from wherever you get your podcasts.